Theater is about enhancing empathy. So you tell stories about people who might not look like you or live like you or love like you, and it allows you to see what we all have in common.
Hi, I'm historian and psychotherapist Andy Erdman, and this is Feel Familiar? Emotionally Intelligent History, a show where we look at important but sometimes little known or forgotten events and people from the past in order to better understand the present day. We'll also see how feelings, thoughts, fantasies, and ideas drive people to make history.
There's more to history than what you've been taught. History repeats, it may or may not. Time's got baggage, we all do. Erdman's here to walk us through what, when, where, how, who. Feel familiar? Crack the spine, a times-old script. We're diving in where the facts have slipped. It's history told with wit and care, with ghosts and guests, no thoughts to spare. Who, what, why, how, where. Feel familiar?
All right. Well, welcome to Feel Familiar, Emotionally Intelligent History, Season 2. We're going to be focusing on the history of drag, and in particular, we're going to be looking at something called Womanless Weddings, which was a huge craze in the Deep South in the early part of the 20th century, also the Heartland. Very interesting phenomenon of very prominent men dressing up in female impersonation, dressing up as brides, bridesmaids, putting on these weddings, and just gives a whole different sense of how drag and female impersonation has been used as the right tries to vilify it these days. Let's look at a recent example of that vilification. I think it's pretty instructive and sets the stage, literally and figuratively, for this season of Feel Familiar? Emotionally Intelligent History. In April of 2025, the Alabama State House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly to pass Bill HB 67. All 77 Republicans present voted yay, with 3 of 15 Democrats joining that yay. All 12 of the nays were from other Democrats, and then some of the legislators either abstained or weren't there for the vote. So what was the bill that these Alabama lawmakers so heftily supported? You guessed it, a ban on drag, which the bill defined as, quote, a performance in which a performer exhibits a sex identity that is different from the sex assigned to the performer at birth, using clothing, makeup, or other physical markers. Specifically, HB 67 called for banning drag at libraries and public schools unless parents of all the kids attending had given prior consent. There ensued a brief frenzy in which public schools, attempting to avoid prosecution, scurried to cancel productions of plays like Peter and the Starcatcher. So an amendment was made to limit the drag ban to public libraries and public school libraries. At an open hearing, a transgender individual from Auburn wondered if they'd be banned from a library because they identified and dressed as a woman, but still retained some facial hair. Is my beard drag? Asked Zephyr Scalzetti. Apparently, that decision would be left in the hands of local librarians, which maybe boded well for gender nonconformers, unless they made noise in the library. Meanwhile, Alabama citizen Ted Halley, who identified as male, who had detransitioned after 12 years of transgender life, spoke out in favor of the bill, declaring that, quote, drag shows are grooming children to be transgender, though apparently presenting no evidence for his concerns. One of the 77 representatives who had voted for HB 67 was Mr. Reed Ingram, founder of a successful aftermarket truck customization business, and who later became a commissioner for Montgomery County and then went on to be elected to the Alabama State House in 2014. He was once a Democrat, now a Republican. Interestingly, though perhaps not surprisingly at all, in 1990, when future Representative Ingram was in his late 20s, he performed in a long popular ritual among prominent men in the Deep South and beyond. He dressed up as a fetching young lady as part of an all-male performance known as a womanless wedding. Womanless weddings had been concocted in the American South, probably in Mississippi around 1916. Womanless weddings, then, had been around for 3/4 of a century at the time, and few looked askance at them from their inception onward. Beginning around 1916 and emerging practically out of the blue, womanless weddings caught on like wildfire and remained a staple of conservative, fraternal life among presumptively heteronormative straight guys in the Deep South, Great Plains, Midwest, and eventually the Northeast. In these drag extravaganzas, sometimes described as burlesques, thousands of men dragged up as brides, bridesmaids, mothers of the bride, flower girls, and everyone else necessary for a traditional wedding, including grooms, ministers, guests, and even surprise celebrity wedding crashers like Charlie Chaplin and Kaiser Wilhelm. The 1990 womanless wedding near Montgomery, Alabama, featuring Reed Ingram, coiffed in dark curls and framed by a wide-brimmed sun hat and large hoop earrings, had been a perennial ritual for 50 or so years, according to a local newspaper. The Civic Club and the Community Club of the Montgomery suburb of Pike Road, quote, joined forces to preserve the tradition. The event took place at Woodland United Methodist Church. The bridesmaids, some quite feminine and illusionistic, others more campy and cartoonish, were met with cheers and catcalls from the crowd. County Commissioner Lynn Gowan played the parson, joining man and man in comic matrimony. By the way, we reached out several times to Representative Reed Ingram's office in Alabama, and they acknowledged receipt of our request for an interview or comment, but we never heard back. The point of all this is not to show the hypocrisy of our political leaders in some kind of gotcha fashion, though some listeners won't mind that. Nor is it simply to shed light on a once commonplace, hugely popular fad among conservative men in the United States, womanless weddings with men in bridal veils. Though as an historian of popular culture and also a psychotherapist, I am endlessly fascinated with weird or forgotten fads and personalities of the past, the thinking behind them, and their relevance to our current day. But the much more important point I am trying to make is this, and it's a point based in extensive historical research that we'll see throughout the course of this season. At a moment when government bodies are consuming time, effort, and taxpayer resources to police the art of drag, not to mention accusing gender nonconformers as dangerous infiltrators, it's essential to know that for much of Western history, the art of drag and female impersonation has been a comfortable, stable, and intrinsic ally of the male power structure, the patriarchy, if you prefer. Put another way, the manosphere loves drag, and vice versa. From ancient Greece, where men kept women out of the public sphere by playing female roles in classical tragedies at national civic festivals, to the medieval church, where priests, altar boys, and parishioners played parts ranging from the Three Marys to peasant wives, to Shakespeare's day and beyond, where many an elite theater-goer considered men more beautiful and effective in women's roles than women, and on to womanless weddings, which thrived among prominent, powerful men in the Jim Crow South and raised money for such conservative causes as Confederate monuments, missionary societies, and Bible classes. In all of this, I'd argue, we'll see a common through line. Rather than subverting or weakening straight, mainstream male power, drag has, for the most part, been a notable, if unlikely, brick in the wall of that dominance. When mainstream men feel comfortable in their power, they themselves drag up, and they openly praise drag artists like Edward Kinniston, who beautifully and sensually impersonated female roles in 1600s London, and was beloved by the king, and squired about by nobles in their fancy carriages, while Kinniston was in full drag, to the brilliant and beauteous female impersonator Julian Elting, who was deemed by a newspaper at the time one of the greatest of all stage stars in Jazz Age America. Often at the same time, thousands of heteronormative men over the ages have joined forces to put on amateur, yet elaborate and widely admired drag musicals, cross-dressed rituals, and yes, transvestic weddings, usually to support their own power and specialness, to raise money for esteemed civic causes and reinforce conservative norms about gender, marriage, capitalism, sexual permissiveness, and women's rights. Oh, and yeah, they also did it to have fun and enjoy themselves in a realm of make-believe, away from the crushing hierarchy of the office and rigid restraints of social mores. As we will see, it is usually only at times of anxiety and fracture, when the pillars of the patriarchy and their allies feel threatened by others who are fighting for their human rights, or by world historical changes out of their control, such as wars, economic nosedives, and shifts in geopolitical power, that gender variance and drag start to be looked at as sus, as perverted. A threat to the youth, unpatriotic, fifth column stuff, un-American, what have you. It's more complicated than that, of course, and there are surely times and places when one may find the art of drag not quite fitting this narrative, but the preponderance of the evidence tells a story that some may be unaware of, and others may find hard to accept. Drag and the manosphere have been tight bros, fitting one another like a dude's hairy, ropey leg packed into a classy silk stocking. This season on Feel Familiar, Emotionally Intelligent History, we'll tell that story. So welcome to Season 2 of Feel Familiar. Womanless, how drag and the manosphere have been tight, from ancient Greece to the American Deep South. And we'll be doing it with the help of my friend, the journalist, podcaster, social commentator, and theater expert, Stephen Robinson. You might know him. He's the author and host of the Playtyper Guy newsletter and podcast. And it covers politics, culture, the arts, and something else that interests you. He's also a contributor to Public Notice and the AV Club. Stephen, is that the Onion AV Club?
Yes, it is.
Right. And he's the board chair of the Portland Playhouse in Portland, Oregon. He's a person of the theater and well-positioned to be our guest. Stephen, welcome. So can you tell us a little bit about the Portland Playhouse and what that is and what your involvement with it is?
So the Portland Playhouse operates out of what was once a former church in the historically Black neighborhood, which is now the Alberta Arts neighborhood, which kind of went through the similar transition of many kind of similar neighborhoods where predominantly Black, that sort of shifted, became sort of more of a queer arts hub, and then that kind of shifted and more hipster people moved. And now that includes me. But I love that neighborhood. I love the area. The Portland Playhouse started doing a lot of work focused on the work of August Wilson, one of my favorite playwrights, and sort of with a mission of doing stories about, people who had lived in that community and still live in that community. That's also brought into sort of telling stories that are inclusive. The idea is I've always seen theater is about enhancing empathy. So you tell stories about people who might not look like you or live like you or love like you, and it allows you to see what we all have in common. And I think it does that very well. My wife is from Portland, so we had been in Europe for a bit and kind of traveling about, settled back in the Northwest. And one of the first productions we saw was a Portland Playhouse doing Angels in America, which is one of my favorite plays. And I was blown away by it, and sort of, I've always been into theater, always been into the arts and writing about theater and so forth. And so I was excited to talk to you about this in particular, especially in the sense of the backlash towards drag, the politicization of art. And I've been writing about that on a newsletter. So, I'm very excited to get into this.
Yeah. And it is timely. And I'm going to talk about some of the trends that emerge in why and when there are backlashes against people dressing a certain way, both on stage and off. I should say we also have our producer with us, Joshua Dudley from New York. Joshua, how are you?
Andrew, Stephen, good to be here.
Welcome back. We know that you drove through the night from Virginia to get here. Stephen, can you tell us a little about you grew up in South Carolina, is that right?
That's correct. Greenville, South Carolina, which has changed tremendously since I left home in the early 90s. It now has a sort of hopping downtown culture. My wife and I were there once, and we were at a sushi restaurant being served by a woman with tattoos. Nothing in that sentence would have been true when I was there. They have like craft beer places now where, I worked at I was interning at a newspaper, the local newspaper that was downtown, and it was so dead. The young reporters would have to go to a Bennigan's in the mall after for drinks. And now it's all,
it's all like
hopping and everything. So it's great. My family's still there. The history of the South, I've always found fascinating. Yes. So much of the arts, from jazz, blues, and how that influenced rock and roll, and then how that then goes to England. So much of what, these English artists were connecting with was frankly art from the South. And I always been sort of proud of that and interested in that. And of course, our food, which shortens our lives. I've had to phase out from some of that, but it's wonderful. So I adore it. But yes, the backlash, unfortunately, for a lot of this stuff also occurs in the South as well. We've seen that as about people, obviously trans culture is very different from drag culture, and you get into that. And I have more to say when you talk about those distinctions, particularly in the arts as well.
And definitely we're going to be seeing, what drag looks like in a different time in, the sort of quote unquote conservative South. By the way, speaking of what English musicians do with Southern American Black music, if you listen to Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones, it's, you can just hear Mick Jagger please, it's just his love affair with that entire sound. And it's great. Stephen, by the way, so did you do theater growing up in Greenville, South Carolina? But it sounds like Greenville is sort of becoming the Asheville. It's like, F you, North Carolina. We have an Asheville too. We have.
Yes.
That was the vibe I was getting.
It's definitely become culturally in that realm. I think still a little bit more conservative than Nashville. Yeah. So if you go on the Instagram, they'll have those little battles, they sort of like Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, where they're sort of sister cities, but one's the sort of snobbier sister, and one's the, doesn't quite have their act together yet, is their view.
Well, if Greenville votes out Lindsey Graham, I would consider going there and having a craft beer and a...
Yes.
Just saying.
Yes. I kind of wound up minoring in theater in college, and wisely, I was a mature kid and said, okay, well, I love theater, but I'm not going to get a major in theater because I've got to go and get a job, and it's the 90s, so I'm going to major in print journalism because then I will have a job for life.
Yes, I remember.
We don't always choose wisely.
No. Oh, listen, I had a magazine job at a big magazine in the early 90s, and it was like, oh, this is... I didn't know it was like the very end of that we were coming to the edge and going over the cliff. But all right, so let's talk about drag and female impersonation in theater history. And as most students of the theater, Western theater, maybe the global Northern theater, know, when we talk about the history of theater, it typically begins in Greece, in Athens, in the Golden Age, around 500s BC. And, Stephen, you must be familiar with we're talking about Oedipus Rex and the Trojan women, et cetera. And these plays, they weren't put on the way we go to see plays today. They were part of big civic and political festivals. They had a kind of religious, mythic, dimension to them. And women were not included on stage. Men played all the parts. So in all of these great plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, men are playing every part. We're talking about Clytemnestra, Hecuba, Antigone. I remember seeing, Diane. Who was in the Avengers, Stephen? Diana
Rigg.
Diana Rigg. I remember seeing her play Medea. This is in the early 90s on Broadway, and it was fantastic. But just to think that role was written for a man in woman's clothing, and we're going to see this through Shakespeare's time. So I kind of have to twist my brain a little bit to kind of remember that. And the Greek theater, the actors are wearing sort of stylized capes and robes and masks. They're not sort of illusionistically trying to impersonate women. We don't have a lot of evidence. There are some paintings on pottery shards. There was a lot of painted pottery back in ancient Greece, and we have lots of shards. Some actors are even portrayed as performing in the nude, some men. I don't know what that was about. But there are two ideas that I want to get across here. By the way, certain male characters were also portrayed in an impressionistic way, usually in comedies, because they had a big strap-on wooden dick known as the phallus. So you have this kind of gender idealization, theatricalization, and two themes that we're going to see, and this is occurring here in the Greek theater, is you have the exclusion of women. So there are no female bodies on stage. And at the same time, there's a depiction of some kind of, this is what woman should be, or this is what womanhood looks like, all in the control of men. So it's really interesting to see those two things going on at the same time. Now, I will say, to the extent that there always is a queer element in performance and in life itself, people are having all sorts of experiences when dressed up and wearing the drag. Yeah, I think this is important for students of theater history. And I don't know, Stephen, what your experience has been, if any, with the classical theater, seeing it, putting it on. I don't know if you had anything to say, but I wanted to give you a moment.
Yeah, I think it's often that sort of understanding for folks of, the complexity of it, but it wasn't specifically a drag performance as we think of it. So sometimes people think, anyone seeing Shakespeare plays originally, what we think of as a drag performance was not what Lady Macbeth was, not a drag performance. Yes. Juliet obviously wasn't. And that always fascinated me when I sort of started to kind of understand that would be, for want of a better word, the fact that they're playing it straight. Like, this Othello and Desdemona, that's an intense scene and it's not meant to be drag. Like, this is a woman. Totally. And Juliet and Romeo, the balcony scene, he's making love to a woman, and that is being played very clearly that way. There's a bit of obviously an over-the-topness or a comic or winkness to drag as the art form has developed over the years that wasn't, I would say, present there. Though I have joked that, like, obviously the nurse in Juliet almost feels like a drag performance, but...
Because the nurse is a little more over the top, or there's something...
Yeah, just sort of the over the top. Like, it feels like, that you could put someone and say, a man who's done a lot of drag performance saying you're playing the nurse, and without necessarily monitoring how, he's performed drag, he would be like, I could do the nurse. Whereas, like, a drag performer suddenly doing, you can't play Juliet as if you're, imitating Liza Minnelli, because that's not quite right what you're supposed to be doing.
Like to see that.
That would be great.
But Stephen, you bring up a really important point, and I am going to address this a little more formally. There is drag, there's camp, there's female impersonation. These are like Venn diagrams that overlap, but also have different valences. And so, drag and camp have a certain ironic, maybe a bit of a subversive dimension to them. But this, what's sometimes called true disguise that you're talking about, has a different intention to it, which is this illusionistic, it's seductive. I would say it's also unintentionally subversive. It can't help but be. But yes, I totally think that's important. So the famous Greek tragedies in which women were depicted very seriously, even though we're using the term drag, there's nothing campy about them. These are part of very important religious, political, and harvest festivals which honored the smooth functioning of the state. And these festivals, if you've studied Greek theater, you might know the name of them. The City Dionysia, which, good name for a brewery, I think. There probably is one in Portland. The Lanaya. And I want to point this out, and this is going to come up again, which is the way in which female impersonation and gender variance is put to a conservative cause. And I don't mean conservative necessarily in the modern political sense of like low taxes, throw out people who aren't white, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they conserve the fundamental underpinnings of society. They, in a weird way, keep things in place. And even though womanless weddings are very different, we're going to see that same phenomenon. And we're going to see it in between as well. And my observation, and Stephen and Joshua, I'll welcome your observations as you go along. I think that when the seat of power, the patriarchy, feels the most comfortable and feels unchallenged, it is dominant men who are very comfortable with drag, doing it, seeing it, promoting it. There's nothing perverse or other about it. And it's certainly true in the 1910s and 20s. Drag is not used, or even gender nonconforming is not used as a target the way it is today. Mm-hmm. And then in times of this insane reactionism, or in some ways predictable reactionism, we see gender and sexuality targeted.
Yes, and I think that's a point that politically I've addressed that is often missed. So people will talk about, Bugs Bunny would do drag all the time, and that was a joke. And Peter Pan is a wonderful twist where, because Peter Pan was often, traditionally played by a woman, there's a point where Pan flirts with Captain Hook while dressed as a woman. So it's a woman pretending to be a boy, pretending to be a woman.
Yes.
And
double impersonation.
And those things what's the issue with those, and like why are we so freaking out now? Well, because now we say that being trans or even cross-dressing, these are mainstream things. Like someone could live, we want people to live their life as a trans person. It is not a joke. It is not a punchline.
Yes.
So, Bugs Bunny is not doing that in the sense of this is an acceptable way to live your life. It is a joke, and I'm pretending to be a woman. And, there have been Archie comics where Archie's trying to he poses as his housekeeper so that Mr. Weatherby doesn't, because he's been skipping school, and he's like, oh, I'm, playing the housekeeper, which I think for some reason goes back. I often see that trope a lot in comedy of the person pretending to be their housekeeper. And I think another way of playing broad, right? Because the idea is I'm at this class, so a woman... pretend to be black, pretend to be a housekeeper. It's class drag.
You're going to see that in the womanless weddings too, but yeah.
Yep. Mrs. Doubtfire, anyone?
Yeah.
But it's so true, Stephen. You bring up a really good point, which is that when material lived reality starts to become a real thing, then that's when the forces of reaction tend to really freak out. We're okay with Bugs Bunny doing it. It's really the concept of hegemony, which is, look, reality has to have certain boundaries. And we're going to tell you which ones you can cross and which ones you can't. And now with people, living their lived experience as drag performers or as trans people, that's when there's the explosion against it. So that's a really important point. As we were saying, I'm using drag here. It's something of an anachronism. The term drag dates back to about the mid-1800s. It refers to the drag of the dress as opposed to the trouser leg. But I'm going to be using it, and let's feel free to use it fairly synonymously. But we do understand, Stephen, just as you were saying, that drag itself has connotations to marginalization, resistance. We're even going to see that the first drag queen to whom we could apply that term was a black man named Dorsey Swan in the 1890s, I believe. And we're going to touch on that. So back in Athens, we have these male actors who are projecting the concept of woman from a stage and from a political realm from which women are excluded. Theater and drama is not separate from civics and the political realm. And there's an interesting case that I've seen made, which is that it's often said that homosexuality was widely accepted in ancient Greece because men were known to have sex with men. And at least one historian has said, the way you have to understand sexuality in ancient Greece is that free men are at the top, in other words, male citizens. And sex is more about power. If you're below them, the men get to decide who to have sex with, whether it's a man who's a slave, whether it's a minor, or whether it's a woman. They're all below them. So sex is more about the penetrator showing their power. And it's just something kind of intriguing to kind of throw out there.
Mm-hmm. And in Angels in America has the famous line from Roy Cohn who says, I'm not going to curse on your show, but I have sex with men. I am not a homosexual. I am not that class. And I think that was sort of the thing of again, I am a transgender person. This is my identity. I am gay. I have just my identity and I have a life as a gay person. It's very different from, I'm the Duke of whatever and I go out and whatever I'm going to do at the private club with the guys is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to go back and live a quote unquote normal life is very, very different.
I think you're bringing up an important aspect of all of this. And, the psychology behind this is when people are willing to conform to a certain compartmentalization of their own internal life and social life, somehow the powers that be are cool with it. Just like you said, when people no longer want to compartmentalize, but they want to integrate and be who they are in public life, that's when it gets to be a problem. So, I don't want to keep hitting on the same point, but just to notice the ways in which gender variance on stage has been used to kind of reinforce the social structure. Now, Greece was very influential, ancient Athens. It's on the small side, and then it declines. And of course, in its place, we get Rome. And I always hear like the Maud theme, like, ride on Rome, here comes Rome. And the Roman Republic, later the Empire, was founded in 753 BC, and it eventually comes to dominate the Mediterranean after winning the Punic Wars, which I think is a funny name because they were fought against Carthage. And Rome eventually conquers what's left of Greece in 146 BC. And if you're familiar, Stephen, you may be familiar with this, the Romans are very good at being architects and military conquerors and engineers. What they're not so great at is culture, and they totally cannibalize Greek culture, right? They literally copy it. They make statues that are copies. A lot of the classical Greek statues that we have in museums are actually Roman copies. And they love Greek drama and design. And so there are not many Roman playwrights whose name we know, particularly serious playwrights. The one that I know, and this is because I took a class on him in college, is Seneca. Have you heard of Seneca? Are you at all familiar with Seneca?
Mm.
Does that name mean anything to you? Yeah. But I think for people who don't know much about drama, it would be, unknown. There's a Seneca Falls in upstate New York, which has all of these names of places from classical antiquity. You can go from like Rome to Utica to Seneca. So the Romans really cannibalized Greek drama. And so Seneca, who's the most famous Roman playwright, he's born just before the year 0, which I think must have been weird. Obviously, they didn't call it like, but we got to count upwards now.
Yes, we're 0 now.
I once saw a stand-up comic years ago, like, what happened in the year 1 where people are like, I'm still writing 0 on my checks. Writing checks, right? No year. So anyway, Seneca's most famous plays were Oedipus, The Trojan Women, Agamemnon. Sound pretty familiar, right? Mm-hmm. And they were, again, all male cast, but they were this love song to Greek culture. The Romans did write what I think must have been their like comedy improv stuff, which were called the Fescennine verses. And they were not high art. Where the Romans do shine on stage is in comedy. And one of my favorite playwrights is Plautus. He wrote the play that the Comedy of Errors is based on, the twin Menachmi, and also Terence. They're the two surviving comic playwrights. What I love about these plays is they feel like sitcoms. They're domestic. They don't deal with like gods so much and kings. They're like, people disguising themselves and getting into all sorts of shenanigans. Then it all kind of gets resolved at the end. So that's kind of becomes the fate of Roman theater. Now, the one place in Roman culture where women are playing women are in the traveling mime troupes. And of course, theater people are they're sort of like carnies. They have their own culture, their own society. They're outside of the mainstream. And so there, these wandering carnies will come in and women do perform. But, on the official stage, women are excluded. And I would like to point out that Emperor Caligula did like to drag up as the goddess Venus in public. I think nobody challenged him. And there was an emperor who became emperor at age 14 in the year 218 AD or CE, named Elagabulus, who underwent voluntary castration to become, quote unquote, a true woman. So interesting, the person in power can do as they wish. Stephen, by the way, since we're speaking about people in power, drag and the right, do you have any thoughts, observations about Kristi Noem's husband? And as we record this is April of 2026.
Yeah, it's interesting that particular kink, like he's not just sort of wearing his clothing, but pretending he has massive
Yeah.
breasts. It was fascinating because he is very much exposing himself, pun intended, to an undocumented sex worker.
Yes.
You would think that there would be sort of a kind of friendly market for it, a friendly MAGA perversion ring. So these are MAGA friendly people, and you can be as perverted as you want amongst them, but
So fascinating.
there's no risk of them sort of like having every every motivation to expose you for what your issues are, which again goes back to the private clubs or whatever. The idea of
Yes.
like there's these realms and you could do whatever you want and things would be kept in sort of eyes wide shut. The whole kind of concept of these old sort of
Behind closed doors.
rich people have closed doors and there's very rigorously excluded. Yet both him, then Anthony Weiner before, are men who, I guess, because they're outside of that, are much more reckless. They're doing things that, again, back in the old days. So yeah, you could do this, but yes, you can't really trust, and especially dangerous in this case, that apparently it had never been screened. Like you would think through background screening, either someone would say that this is a potential issue, or that obviously Chrissy Nome did not know.
Yeah.
She was putting herself out there in great risk, because that's the risk of blackmail, is often not just the cabinet member or the member in the administration, but their family,
Yes.
who would be sort of a pressure point. And so you kind of don't want to sort of do that, but they did. And I had written about this a year ago, where Christy Nome had her bag stolen in a DC restaurant, and it was she had $3,000 in cash in the bag, which made no sense. And I had joked at the time, it's like, wasn't that like a mob payoff or something, like some sort of payoff? Obviously,
Yes.
I don't mean to speculate that she was obviously being blackmailed, but it was one of those things of like, in retrospect, it was like, well,
Yes.
that is a weird, here, I'm going to drop, because she put her purse like by her feet, which is a sort of a rookie move. No one does that. Like every woman I talked to, like even if they were from Mayberry,
Yeah.
like Aunt B was like, I'm not going to put my purse on the floor. It would get stolen.
Yes.
And she put her purse by her feet. The guy grabbed it and then was stolen, all the money and that. And she had a bunch of stuff in, of course. So it was a very suspicious situation. But it is unfortunate. A source of great humor for people who don't like either of them. But
That's really interesting about I had never thought of that it was kind of perhaps like an intentional thievery, like a payoff. I will say, and you touched on this too, which is, and I've worked with, as a therapist, I've worked with people who have various behavioral addictions, and just the increasing intensity and the danger amps up just that fundamental level of intensity of emotional, it's kind of an emotional misdirection, and it makes it all the more pleasurable and all the more dangerous, and the crash, even bigger. I was also struck with, and maybe Joshua, feel free to weigh in if you want to. I was struck with, and I want to use this word carefully, there was an intentionally grotesque nature of these massive breasts. They're almost like the equivalent of the Greek phallus. There's something so giant and out of control about them that it's almost a form of drag. It's trying to break through the constraints that this person might feel internally or externally. Anyway, just as somebody who's psychoanalytically oriented, I like that. Joshua, please.
I'm sorry about this, Andrew, but unfortunately, I chose to look away from this particular car crash, so I don't know the details of the story.
Okay, well, Google it, maybe on somebody else's computer, and you'll find out all about it. It's sort of fascinating.
Yes. But I remember reading somewhere that apparently the male obsession or heterosexual male obsession with large breasts or breasts of any size is some sort of evolutionary getting us to look in the eyes of our mate so that you are more inclined to stay together, because otherwise before we kind of preferred from behind. And if you look at what was behind, it is sort of a similar kind of concept, right? So it's still sort of, okay, well, these two large round things that you can kind of look at, but in front, so that you are now at least making eye contact and you'll stick around with your mate.
Yes.
I mean, human sexuality is bizarre, but the evolutionary aspect of that I found fascinating to the extent that it might have been true.
No, it's really interesting. I have a lot of problems with strict evolutionary biology. I think it ends up sort of leading mouth-breathing morons to kind of like justify all sorts of horrible things. But, Stephen, your point is well taken. Freud, in Civilization and Its Discontents, goes on a lengthy footnote, and he says, well, when pre-humans used to mate, it was by smell. There was a certain time of month when there would be a certain odor, and then the male would mount the female from behind. But then as they started to stand and, stand erect, they would see each other, and now the male had to stick around to take care of the child. So erotic stimulation transferred to the eyes, so that we're seeing it, and every time I see it, I'm stimulated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're referencing Freud, if not other people there too. Okay, so Rome, as we know, eventually falls. Corrupt, power-hungry, too big to succeed, which some might say of another big empire at the moment. And what begins to take its place as kind of an organizing structure in Europe is the Christian church. And if you are interested in the rise and fall of Rome, Mike Duncan's podcast, The History of Rome, is a must listen. I love Mike Duncan. He does the Revolutions podcast. Anyway, so the church comes in and they make their views on theater and all things theatrical very clear. It is not good. It is bad. It's immoral. It's pagan. It's non-Christian. And they make fun of the gods. And they're not even the right gods, but still, let's not go down that path. And so you have the church fathers, who I call the early Christian influencers, Tertullian, St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom. Stephen, I was raised sort of putatively Jewish, but did you have much of a Christian education growing up? Or I don't know what your religious...
Oh, yeah. I grew up, Southern Baptist.
Okay.
But obviously it didn't stick. But culturally, the entertainment and the aspect of the culture and the community of it,
yes.
I still have, fondness for and fond memories of that aspect. But I could never
quite
buy it.
I seem to remember you telling me that certain TV shows were censored in South Carolina, like the Golden Girls were considered too... I don't know.
Yeah, well, the Golden Girls, anything that was too racy would get because the TV guide would be national, so it would say this is what you could see, but South Carolina would say no, and it would inevitably be in prime time an episode of Mama's Family that was their swap in. I loved Mama's Family, but this is the syndicated version where Carol Burnett was no longer part of.
Okay,
and that's what I always remember. It was just oh man, what am I'm enjoying Mama's Family, but I could have been missing whatever racy. Of course, it's the mid '80s, so it could have just been any an interracial couple on a TV show or something. God knows, but
right. It'd be interesting to know what was cut out. But yes, anyway. So the church fathers, and were you ever exposed to this? Are the names Tertullian? I've heard of St. Augustine, but only because I went to college. St. John Chrysostom. I guess these, if you're really into Christian theology, these were the early people who shaped Christian theology. So they hate the theater. St. Augustine says in his famous blog, The Confessions, written in 397 AD,
"And it is for that reason, friends, that I say, why is it that man desires to be made sad, beholding doleful and tragical things, which yet himself would by no means suffer?"
Which is interesting because Aristotle, if you've ever read Aristotle's theory on the theater, he says that's what's good about theater. You go, you feel these terrible emotions, and then you're sort of rid of them. Not that I believe that, but this is kind of part of standard theorizing about the theater. Why would people want to go and feel bad?
Andrew, I have a thought about that.
Please.
It sounds like the ancient church was afraid of people actually feeling feelings, which feels like a counterpoint to today when there's this evangelical movement against empathy. There's this popular book called The Sin of Empathy happening right now.
And it's also the feeling of catharsis. When I've given feedback both to writers or when I've done stuff like that, it's in every piece of work, that what is the feeling? Because something can be very sad on paper, but has a feeling when you leave the theater. What is that feeling? If you feel a good feeling, that's successful as far as what people wanting to see it. But sometimes I think, here's my very hip, clever comedy, but there's no feeling at your laugh.
Yes.
Like maybe there's even the humor is not rooted in anything that is something that makes you feel. It's very sort of a distance, and people kind of want to have a feeling when they leave, and usually a positive one, but essentially how you deliver that can be different.
Yes, absolutely. In psychological terms, is there an affective experience of going to the theater and coming from it? And by the way, Joshua, I just want to echo what you just said, which is it speaks again, I think, to the importance of emotional compartmentalization, or what we would call in psychotherapeutic terms, dissociation in maintaining authorities of power, whether it's the family structure or a nation. Dad is a good man and he does this, so don't have any feelings about it. You can both love someone and hate them at the same time. So I just wanted to touch on that because I think that is quite relevant. Yeah, the sin of empathy. God, that title tells you it all. All right. So the church bans the theater. It's bad. It's horrible. And what, of course, begins to happen is that people love the theater too much to actually keep it entirely out of the realm of people's existence. So the church itself starts to theatricalize, and it adds more rituals, performance-like processions, parades. It starts to become more of a spectacle, which, think about it, you have the church now. It was this bunch of barefoot people running around protesting the Roman Empire. Now they've got churches. They've got power. They've got institutional power, and they want people to keep coming to church. People who are by and large illiterate, don't understand Latin, and I have to imagine want to be anywhere, but they think they're going to, die and go to hell. So maybe that's they're using a lot of stick there to keep asses in seats, but you need some carrot. And, as I was thinking, they probably don't want to be there. They probably would rather be drinking mead at the local tavern and making jokes about the wife of Bath.
Wife of Bath? More like wife needs a bath.
So the church, and I can just imagine we can't have theater, but how about if we start zhuzhing up some of our rituals and some of the mass? And you can see by the 900s, the year 900, theater is starting to creep back into religion. And at some churches in Europe, on Palm Sunday, the church starts to put on this parade in which somebody plays the part of Jesus, in other words, acting, and they put that person on a donkey, and that person parades from outside the city walls to the church. So things like that are happening. They're definitely zhuzhing up the whole religious experience to keep butts in seats. And then you start to see something which is also fascinating, and this is what happens in ancient Greece. It also happened in ancient Egypt, which is you have these epic poems, these almost religious poems that people used to just recite, And then Odysseus said, "We must build a horse." And his followers said, "Yes, we will build a horse." And someone gets the idea well, why don't I just say it as if I'm Odysseus? And then you can say the other part, and then we can talk to each other. So what had been prose, recited prose, becomes drama. And that's how we have drama. It's thought that happened actually in ancient Egypt. And so you have scenes out of the Bible that start to be acted like short sketches or short plays. And there's a small sketch that dates back to Easter in the year 925. And it's the moment, this is appropriate because Easter Sunday just happened, when the three Marys approach the tomb of Jesus.
Whom seek ye in the tomb, O Christians?
Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified, O heavenly beings.
He is not here. He is risen as he foretold. Go and announce that he is risen from the tomb.
So they're starting to drama up the Bible. And later that century, in the 970s, Ethelwald, Bishop of Winchester, writes something called the Regularis Concordia, or a monastic agreement, and it contains little religious sketches. And he is among the early playwrights. Stephen, have you ever heard of a playwright from the same era named Hroswitha? Does that strike a bell at all?
Not intentionally. Please elaborate.
Yeah. Hroswitha was a nun in Germany. This is in the 900s, and she wrote 6 plays. She is one of the earliest that we know female playwrights. And the plays, they took themes and subjects from Terence, who we were just talking about, the Roman playwright, but kind of substituted in religious Christian characters and stories. I don't know quite how she did it. I haven't read her plays, but it's fascinating. Like, you take the stuff that people like, which is comedy and theater and popular playwrights, and you sort of flavor it with Christianity. And it's a roll of the dice as to which side is going to win, the Christian or the theatrical. It's really not. The theatrical is always going to win in any case. So churches are becoming more theatrical, and on holidays, and this is in the early Middle Ages. If you can think of medieval churches as having a lot of different parts to them, alcoves and chapels, they start putting up stages and putting on Bible scenes. And then eventually somebody gets the idea, let's put those stages on wheels and make little rolling theaters to take these Bible scenes around town. And those rolling theaters are called pageants. And you have kind of the artisans' guilds taking ownership of various Bible stories. And it's very early brand sponsorship. Like the shipwrights are producing Noah and the Ark. And the goldsmiths are doing the Gift of the Magi. And these are known as mystery plays. And again, women are excluded. They are not playing women's parts. But then men start to, Stephen, as you were saying earlier, playing very sincere female parts. There's a report from the city of Metz around this time that there was an adolescent boy who played Saint Barbara so thoughtfully and reverently that the people wept for pity. So the church, the most, conservative, powerful institution in the Western world, is using female impersonation and drag to reinforce its own power. Although I have to imagine also at the same time, there's a queer reading of this as well. And I don't know how much you know about the medieval theater, but eventually the Christian church bans theater, then it starts becoming theatrical, then the plays start becoming more performative, and eventually you have plays that are less and less have anything to do with the Bible directly. They use some themes. One of my favorite plays from the Middle Ages is called The Second Shepherd's Play, and it's a short comedy in which this peasant couple, they steal a sheep from some shepherds, and then they disguise it as their infant in a cradle, and then the shepherds show up. That was performed in Wakefield, England around 1450. Anybody who's taken a theater history class probably has read that play. And there also were these very ponderous morality plays like Everyman. They were, poetic. I think they're sort of, boring and ponderous. They're very, they're trying to take Christian lessons and make them theatrical. And those survived well into the 1500s. And it's believed that William Shakespeare, when he was young, may have seen some of those plays and that it therefore influenced Shakespeare. So we're going to wind down episode 1 of Feel Familiar. And I just wanted to see, Stephen, if you had any thoughts or anything you wanted to share with us.
I'm very happy to get into the Shakespeare period of all of this because one of my favorites. Because the Bible itself, if as someone who read it very early, because
you did.
In the early 80s, boredom existed pre-internet. So I remember being in, my grandparents' house. There was no television.
Wow.
I'm in the room where my parents are talking, and I'm bored out of my mind, and I'll just read the Bible. So I remember reading the Bible, but there's all these epic storytelling, right? And so much of the basic of it that we later would see in theater and drama, and how that got put on the stage. I was very fascinated to hear.
Okay, so you can see the connection between Bible stories and
Oh yeah.
And I think there's just something like people like to act. Well, a lot of people like to act. And you can't you can't just say no theater, like the church is here, no theater, because, people are people. They're going to want to find a way to have fun. All right. Well, that's all for episode 1. And by the way, gentle listener, we are aware that Lindsey Graham has died. He had not yet died when we recorded this episode, but he does seem to be dead at the moment, and that seems to be a permanent situation. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we're going to see how drag and female impersonation flourished in Renaissance England, and how Shakespeare's most famous heroines, Juliet and Lady Macbeth, they were all played by men. And I'll also tell you a little about my super male sports summer camp that I went to as a kid, and how we all had no problem with boys dragging up to play girl parts in the camp's plays that we put on. No pun intended. With camp. Could that'd be a pun? The hell with it. I gotta go.
There's more to history than what you've been taught. History repeats, it may or may not. Time's got baggage, we all do. Erdman's here to walk us through what, when, where, how, who. Feel familiar? Crack the spine, a times-old script. We're diving in where the facts have slipped. It's history told with wit and care, with ghosts and guests, no thoughts to spare. Who, what, why, how, where. Feel familiar?